Have you ever watched someone's entire life change because of a stupid dare? Have you ever seen a man walk into a room and unknowingly step into the middle of a war he didn't even know existed? Because what I'm about to tell you started with a dare, a kiss, and a woman whose eyes held secrets that could destroy the most powerful man in that room. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand why sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it looks like the worst mistake of your life. But here's what nobody saw coming, not even me when I first heard this story. The woman he was dared to kiss wasn't just serious. She was dangerous. And the man who dared him, he knew exactly what he was doing. This story was inspired by something that happened to a close friend of mine, and when he told me, I knew I had to share it because some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself. Daniel Wright was 34 years old, a single father to a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie, and he hadn't been to a party in almost 3 years. The last party he attended was his own divorce celebration, which his friends had thrown without his permission, and he'd spent most of it hiding in the bathroom, calling his babysitter to check on Sophie. But tonight was different. His best friend since college, Ryan Mitchell, was celebrating closing the biggest deal of his career, and Ryan had literally shown up at Daniel's apartment, handed him a suit, and refused to leave until Daniel put it on. Daniel stood in the corner of the rooftop venue in downtown Chicago, nursing a drink he didn't really want, watching people mingle and laugh and flirt with an ease he'd forgotten he ever possessed. The city sparkled below them, the September air carrying just enough chill to make the outdoor heaters necessary, and everywhere Daniel looked, people seemed to belong. He didn't belong here. He belonged at home, helping Sophie with her second-grade homework, watching her fall asleep to the same movie she'd watched 47 times, being the father she deserved after her mother had walked out when Sophie was only 2. Ryan appeared beside him, grinning that grin that had gotten them both into trouble more times than Daniel could count. "You look like you're attending a funeral," Ryan said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I'm here, aren't I?" Daniel replied. "That was the deal. I show up, I stay for an hour, I go home to my kid." "Your kid is with your mother, who is thrilled to have her for the night. You have no excuse." Ryan's eyes scanned the party, and then they stopped, fixing on something across the rooftop. "I have an idea." "No. You don't even know what I'm going to say." "I know that look. That's the look that got me arrested in Cancun. We were 19, and the charges were dropped." Ryan grabbed Daniel's shoulder and turned him slightly. "See that woman over there? The one in the black dress, standing by herself, looking like she's calculating the exact moment she can leave without being rude." Daniel looked, and then he couldn't stop looking. She was stunning in a way that felt almost intimidating, with auburn hair pulled back in an elegant twist, pale skin that seemed to glow against the darkness of her dress, and a posture that suggested she'd been trained to never slouch a day in her life. But it was her expression that caught him, that unreadable, almost severe focus, like she was analyzing every person at this party and finding them all wanting. She looked like the kind of woman who didn't suffer fools, who had been through something that had stripped away any patience for nonsense, who carried herself like armor because she'd learned the hard way that the world required it. "That's Victoria Ashford," Ryan said, and something in his voice made Daniel turn back to look at him. "She's apparently impossible to crack. Been at this party for an hour, and I don't think she's smiled once. Multiple guys have tried to talk to her. All of them have retreated looking like they'd just been audited. So she's smart," Daniel said. "She knows these parties are full of people trying too hard." "Exactly, which is why I dare you to go over there and kiss her." Daniel actually laughed. "You're insane. I'm serious. And before you say no, remember that you owe me for that thing in 2019. We agreed never to speak of 2019. And we won't have to, ever again, if you do this one simple thing." Daniel looked back at the woman, Victoria. She was sipping what appeared to be sparkling water, her eyes scanning the crowd with that same analytical precision. Everything about her screamed that she wanted to be anywhere but here, and Daniel understood that feeling so deeply it almost hurt. Ryan, I'm not going to kiss a stranger at a party. That's not who I am anymore. That's not who I ever really was. I didn't say you had to kiss her on the lips. I said kiss her. A hand kiss. Something old-fashioned and ridiculous that might actually make her smile. I've got $100 that says you can't make Victoria Ashford smile tonight. Daniel should have said no. He should have finished his drink, said goodbye, and gone home to the quiet apartment where Sophie's drawings hung on every wall and her shoes were always left in the middle of the hallway, no matter how many times he asked her to put them away. He should have remembered that he wasn't the guy who approached beautiful women at parties anymore, that he was a single father who worked too many hours and slept too few, who had built his entire life around one small person, because that was what she deserved. But something about this woman's expression, something about the way she stood alone in a crowd, something about the invisible weight she seemed to be carrying, made him feel like maybe she understood something about loneliness that he understood too. Fine, he said, surprising himself. But if this goes badly, you're explaining it to my mother when she asks why I'm never dating again. He crossed the rooftop before he could change his mind, and with every step, more details came into focus. The small scar near her left eyebrow, the way her fingers gripped her glass just a little too tightly, the almost imperceptible way her shoulders tensed when she noticed him approaching. This was a woman who had learned to be on guard, and Daniel felt a sudden, unexpected surge of protectiveness, like he wanted to know who had taught her that vigilance was necessary. If you're already invested in what happens next, drop a like right now and let me know you're here with me, because this story is just getting started. I should warn you, he said when he reached her. I'm about to do something ridiculous. Her eyes met his, and they were gray, the color of storm clouds or morning fog, and so guarded that he almost stepped back. I appreciate the warning, she said, and her voice was cooler than the evening air. But I should warn you that whatever line you're about to use, I've heard it before. That's fair. But I promise you haven't experienced this particular approach to humiliation before. He took a breath, feeling every bit as foolish as he probably looked. My friend over there, the one who looks like he peaked in a fraternity, dared me to come over here and kiss you. Which is ridiculous and juvenile, and exactly the kind of thing I stopped doing about a decade ago. But here's the thing, I looked at you standing over here alone, and you looked like you were having exactly as miserable a time as I was. And I thought, maybe instead of pretending to be someone I'm not, I could just come over here and be honest about what a disaster this whole situation is. Something flickered in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a slight softening around her eyes that made him feel like maybe he hadn't completely failed. So you came over here to tell me that you were dared to kiss me, but you're not going to do it. I came over here to introduce myself like a normal person and to offer you an out. We can stand here together, looking like we're having a conversation, and then you can tell everyone I crashed and burned. My friend loses his $100, you get to continue having a miserable time in peace, and I go home feeling like maybe I did one decent thing tonight. She studied him for a long moment, and Daniel felt like he was being evaluated on levels he didn't entirely understand. What's your name? Daniel Wright. I'm an architect. Single father. Generally terrible at parties. What makes you think I'm having a miserable time? You're holding sparkling water instead of champagne, which means you want to stay sharp. You haven't moved from this spot in at least 15 minutes, which means you're trying to minimize interactions. And you keep checking your phone when you think no one's looking, which means there's somewhere else you'd rather be. The softening in her expression deepened. You're observant. I have a 7-year-old daughter. If I'm not observant, she's putting glitter in my coffee again. And then, miraculous and unexpected, Victoria Ashford smiled. It was small, just a slight curve of her lips, but it transformed her entire face, made her look younger and softer and achingly beautiful. I'm Victoria, she said, and the coolness in her voice had thawed by at least a few degrees. I'm a corporate attorney, recently divorced, categorically terrible at parties. Recently divorced. That explains the alertness. Does it? I'm 3 years out from mine. The first year, I went to one party and spent the whole time convinced everyone was either pitying me or judging me. It took me this long to realize that most people are too worried about themselves to notice anyone else's mess. Victoria's smile faded, but something warmer replaced it. A kind of recognition that felt almost like relief. How long were you married? 5 years. She left when our daughter was 2. Said she wasn't meant for the life we'd built. Apparently she was meant for a yoga instructor in Boulder and a lifestyle that didn't include diapers or responsibility. I'm sorry. I'm not. Sophie is the best thing that ever happened to me. And every day I'm grateful that I'm the one who stayed. He paused, realizing he'd just shared more with this stranger in 2 minutes than he'd shared with most people in years. What about you? How recent is recent? Victoria's expression shifted, and Daniel watched walls go back up in real time. Recent enough that I probably shouldn't be at a party thrown by my ex-husband's company. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry, what? Before Victoria could answer, a voice cut through the party noise, smooth and confident, and carrying the particular arrogance of a man who believed every room belonged to him. Victoria, I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Daniel turned to see a man approaching them, tall and polished in a way that screamed expensive, with silver, touched dark hair and eyes that assessed Daniel like he was an insect that had landed somewhere inconvenient. This man looked like he'd never experienced a moment of self-doubt in his life, like he'd been born with a certainty that the world would bend to his will. Victoria's transformation was immediate. Every bit of warmth that had started to emerge vanished, replaced by that same iron composure Daniel had first observed. Gregory, she said, and the single word carried more ice than the November wind. I was invited. By the board, yes. They insisted on keeping up appearances. Gregory's eyes moved to Daniel, and the assessment became more pointed. And who is this? This is none of your concern. Everything at my party is my concern, Victoria. That was always your problem. You never understood that some things couldn't be compartmentalized away. Daniel watched this exchange like a tennis match, pieces clicking into place with uncomfortable speed. This was Gregory's party. Ryan worked for Gregory's company. Victoria was Gregory's ex-wife, and Daniel had been dared to kiss her in front of everyone, at a party thrown by a man who clearly still saw her as his property. He turned to look for Ryan across the rooftop and found his friend already watching, and the expression on Ryan's face wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. Daniel felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a dare. This was a setup. But why? I'm Daniel, he said, turning back to Gregory with a calm he didn't feel. I'm an architect. Victoria and I were just discussing the structural elements of this venue. The cantilever design on the western terrace is particularly impressive. Gregory's eyes narrowed. I don't recall seeing you on the guest list. I came with Ryan Mitchell. He's one of your project managers, I believe. Something shifted in Gregory's expression, a recognition that Daniel didn't understand but filed away for later. Ryan, yes. He's been very useful lately. Gregory turned back to Victoria, and his voice dropped to something more intimate and far more unsettling. We need to discuss the remaining property transfer. My lawyers have concerns. Then have your lawyers contact mine. That's what they're for. I'd prefer to discuss it personally. And I'd prefer to never speak to you again, but we don't always get what we want, do we? Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Enjoy your party, Gregory. I'm sure there are dozens of women here who would love to hear about your property concerns. She took Daniel's arm, the gesture surprising him, and steered them both toward the bar on the other side of the rooftop. Her grip was firm, but shaking slightly, and when they were far enough away, she released him and took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. I'm sorry, she said. I used you as an escape route. That was unfair. I think I was already being used as something. Daniel replied, watching Ryan across the party. His friend had disappeared into the crowd. Do you know someone named Ryan Mitchell? Victoria went very still. He works for Gregory. Why? He's my best friend. He brought me here tonight. And he's the one who dared me to approach you. The color drained from Victoria's face. Daniel, you need to leave. Now. Whatever's happening here, whatever Ryan is involved in, you don't want to be part of it. What are you talking about? Gregory doesn't lose. Ever. Our divorce took 2 years because he fought me on everything. Not because he wanted what I was asking for, but because he couldn't stand the idea of me winning anything. I got the settlement finalized 3 months ago, and he's been looking for ways to undermine it ever since. Victoria's voice dropped lower. If Ryan brought you here specifically to approach me at Gregory's party, in front of Gregory, there's a reason, and that reason is going to benefit Gregory somehow. Daniel's mind raced. Ryan had been his friend for 15 years. They'd been roommates, groomsmen at each other's weddings. The kind of friends who could go months without talking, and then pick up exactly where they left off. But Ryan had also been struggling lately, hints about money problems and work stress that Daniel had dismissed as normal adult complaints. And tonight, Ryan had been very insistent about bringing Daniel to this specific party. I need to find Ryan, Daniel said. And I need to leave. Victoria was already gathering herself, pulling her armor back on piece by piece. Whatever this is, I'm not going to let Gregory pull me into another game. Wait. Daniel didn't know why he said it. Didn't know why he reached out to touch her arm before she could walk away. Have dinner with me. Victoria stared at him. Did you not just hear anything I said? I heard all of it. And I'm standing here realizing that I was probably set up tonight, that my best friend might be involved in something I don't understand, and that every smart instinct I have is telling me to walk away from this entire situation. He paused, and what came out of his mouth next surprised him more than anything else had all evening. But I have a 7-year-old daughter who teaches me every day that sometimes the things that scare you are exactly the things you should run toward. And I haven't felt this interested in talking to another person in 3 years. So, whatever else is happening here tonight, I'd like to see you again. Tomorrow. Somewhere neither of your exes can find us. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel watched her struggle with something internal, some calculation that went beyond what he could see. You're either very brave or very foolish, she said. I'm a single father. Those are basically the same thing. If you're wondering what Victoria decides, what Ryan's involvement really is, and what Gregory is planning, comment now and tell me what you think is going to happen, because I promise you won't guess the full truth. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. There's a restaurant called Portsmouth on the north side. It's quiet, and the owner owes me a favor. Daniel took the card, feeling the weight of it far more than such a small thing should carry. I'll be there. Victoria nodded once, a gesture that was almost regal, and then she was gone, disappearing through the rooftop exit like she'd never been there at all. Daniel stood in her wake, holding her card, feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he didn't fully understand yet. He found Ryan 20 minutes later, down in the building's lobby, pacing near the elevators like he was waiting for someone. There you are, Ryan said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. How'd it go with the Ice Queen? You tell me, Ryan. You seem to have orchestrated the whole thing. Ryan's smile flickered. What are you talking about? Victoria Ashford is Gregory Harrison's ex-wife. And Gregory Harrison is your boss, the one throwing this party, the one who apparently has some kind of ongoing war with her. You brought me here, dressed me up, and pointed me at her like some kind of weapon. Daniel stepped closer, anger building beneath his forced calm. So, I'm going to ask you once, and I need you to be honest with me. What's really going on? Ryan's expression cracked, and what Daniel saw beneath it was worse than anything he'd imagined. Fear. Real, genuine fear. I messed up, Danny. I messed up bad, and Gregory found out, and he gave me a choice. Ryan's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He said, If I could get someone to publicly humiliate Victoria at his party, some kind of scene that he could use against her in court, he'd make my problems go away. I didn't know what else to do. I've got creditors threatening my family. I've got loans I can't pay back. I've thought maybe if you just made a fool of yourself hitting on her, said something that could be twisted. You were going to use me to hurt someone I've never met. To help a man you know is dangerous. Because you made some stupid financial decisions. I didn't think it through. I just needed the pressure to stop. Ryan grabbed Daniel's arm. But listen, it didn't work, right? You didn't do anything wrong. You just talked to her. So we're fine. We just tell Gregory it didn't work, and maybe he'll give me more time, and? I asked her to dinner. Ryan went pale. You what? I asked her to dinner, tomorrow night. She said yes? Danny, you can't. You don't understand what Gregory is like. If he thinks you're actually interested in Victoria, if he thinks you might become something to her, he'll destroy you. He'll find out everything about you, about Sophie, about your work. He'll use it all. Daniel stepped back, looking at his friend of 15 years like he was seeing him for the first time. You know what the hardest part of my divorce was, Ryan? It wasn't losing the marriage. It wasn't even losing the future I'd planned. It was realizing that I'd trusted someone who didn't deserve it, and I hadn't seen it until it was too late. He shook his head slowly. I'm going to that dinner tomorrow, and whatever comes next, I'm going to handle it the way I handle everything now, by being the kind of person my daughter can be proud of. Danny, please. Go home, Ryan. Figure out your own mess. But don't contact me again until you're ready to be honest about who you've become. He walked out of the building and into the Chicago night, and the city seemed louder and more alive than it had in years. He had no idea what he was getting into. He had no idea who Gregory Harrison really was or what Victoria was running from. All he knew was that for the first time since his wife left, he felt awake. Like the parts of him that had gone dormant in survival mode were slowly starting to remember how to hope. Sophie was asleep when he got to his mother's house, curled up on the couch with her favorite stuffed rabbit. Daniel lifted her gently, felt her small arms wrap around his neck in sleepy recognition, and carried her out to the car. She woke up just enough to mumble something about butterflies before falling back asleep, and he drove home through quiet streets, thinking about second chances and dangerous men, and the woman who had smiled at him like he'd given her something unexpected. The next day passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Daniel's architecture firm was in the middle of a major renovation project, and he spent most of the day in meetings, his mind only half present while the other half replayed every moment of his conversation with Victoria. At 3 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Still planning to show tonight. Fair warning, my ex may have already found out. His network is disturbingly efficient. VPA. Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. I've survived a 2-year-old with a stomach virus on a cross-country flight. I can handle whatever Gregory throws at me. Her response came quickly. You might be the most unexpectedly interesting person I've met in years. See you at 7. He arrived at Portsmouth at exactly 7, wearing his second, best suit because his best one was still at the dry cleaner. The restaurant was small and warm, with exposed brick walls and soft lighting that made everything feel intimate. Victoria was already there, seated at a corner table that gave her a clear view of both entrances. She looked different tonight, less armored, her hair down around her shoulders and her expression cautiously curious. You came? She said as he sat down. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might have common sense. I have a 7-year-old. Common sense is the first thing to go. Victoria's laugh was unexpected and genuine, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. Tell me about her. Your daughter. So Daniel told her. He told her about Sophie's obsession with marine biology and her absolute conviction that she would one day discover a new species of octopus. He told her about the way Sophie left her shoes in the middle of every hallway and her belief that breakfast cereal counted as a complete meal. He told her about the hard days, too, The nights when Sophie cried for a mother who wasn't coming back, the guilt he carried about not being able to give her a traditional family, the fierce, terrifying love that made every decision feel monumental. Victoria listened in a way that few people did, with her full attention, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. And when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying something he hadn't expected. "You're a good father." "How can you tell?" "Because you talk about her like she's the most important thing in the world, and you don't seem to resent her for it." "That's rarer than you think." "Did your ex resent the important things in your life?" Victoria's expression flickered. "My ex didn't want there to be important things in my life besides him. That was most of the problem." "How long were you married?" 8 years. "We met when I was in law school. He was already running his first company and I was dazzled, I suppose. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like everything you said was fascinating. It took me years to realize he did that to everyone, and it meant exactly nothing." "When did you realize?" "When I told him I wanted to take a case pro bono for a domestic violence survivor who had nothing to pay me with. He told me I was wasting my time on people who would never matter." Victoria's voice hardened. "That's when I understood that his charm was a tool, not a trait. And that the person I'd married was someone I didn't recognize and didn't want to know." If you're feeling this connection building between them, if you're rooting for Daniel and Victoria to find something real in all this chaos, hit that subscribe button now, because we're about to enter the part of this story where everything gets more complicated and more beautiful at the same time. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about their childhoods, their mistakes, their hopes for futures they were afraid to fully imagine. Daniel told her about the small architecture firm he'd built from nothing, about his dream of designing sustainable housing for communities that couldn't afford it, about the way he'd stopped dreaming for a while after his divorce and was only now starting to remember how. Victoria told him about the settlement she'd won, the foundation she wanted to start for women escaping abusive marriages, and the fear she carried that Gregory would never truly let her go. When the restaurant finally closed around them, they walked out into the cool night air and stood on the sidewalk like neither of them wanted the evening to end. "I should tell you something," Victoria said, "before this goes any further." "Okay, Gregory isn't just fighting me over property. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that he's been funneling money from his company into offshore accounts, hiding it from investors and tax authorities. I have documentation. I have proof, and I've been trying to decide what to do with it." Daniel let this sink in. "You could destroy him. I could expose him. There's a difference. But if I do, he'll know it came from me and he'll retaliate. He'll make my life impossible, even more than he already has. And now that you've entered this picture." She trailed off, looking at him with those storm, gray eyes. "If he sees you as a threat, he'll come after you too. After your business, maybe after your family." Daniel thought about Sophie, about the life he'd built, about everything he had to lose. And then he thought about the woman standing in front of him, carrying evidence of corruption by herself, because she was too principled to let it go and too afraid to move forward. "When I became a father," he said slowly, "I had to decide what kind of man I wanted Sophie to see. I decided I wanted to be someone who stood up for things that mattered, even when it was scary, even when there was something to lose." He reached out and took Victoria's hand, feeling her fingers tremble slightly in his grip. "Whatever you decide to do, you don't have to do it alone." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something that made his heart stop entirely. She stepped forward, rose onto her toes, and kissed him. It wasn't a dare. It wasn't a performance. It was real and searching and carried 3 years of her loneliness and 3 years of his, and when she pulled back, her eyes were brighter than he'd seen them all evening. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. "Neither do I. But I'd like to find out with you." They went to dinner again the following week, and the week after that, And slowly, carefully, something began to grow between them, fragile and tentative and more precious for its uncertainty. Daniel introduced Victoria to Sophie, a terrifying gamble that paid off when Sophie announced within 10 minutes that Victoria was the smartest person she'd ever met besides marine biologists. Victoria started coming to their apartment for Sunday dinners, helping Sophie with homework and laughing at Daniel's terrible attempts at cooking, and gradually, inch by inch, becoming part of their small family. But Gregory was watching. The first sign came when Daniel's biggest client suddenly canceled a major contract, citing concerns about the firm's stability that no one could explain. The second sign came when Daniel's landlord called to say the building had been sold and all tenants would need to vacate within 60 days. The third sign came when Sophie came home from school crying because someone had told her that her father was a bad person who was going to prison. Daniel sat in his half-packed apartment that night, Sophie asleep in her room, and he felt the weight of Gregory's invisible war pressing down on him from all sides. He'd been naive to think he could walk into this situation and come out unscathed. He'd risk everything, his livelihood, his daughter's stability, his entire future, for a woman he'd only known for 2 months. And he didn't regret it. That was the thing that scared him most. Even now, facing the destruction of everything he'd built, he didn't regret choosing Victoria. He regretted being unable to protect Sophie from the fallout. He regretted underestimating Gregory's reach. But he didn't regret the fundamental choice to stand beside someone who needed standing beside. Victoria called at midnight. "I heard about your client. And your apartment. Daniel, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. It's Gregory's fault. Don't give him the satisfaction of taking credit for your conscience. I have to release the documents. I've been a coward, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting until I felt safe. But there is no safe. There's only what's right. What do you need from me? I need you to trust me. I need you to keep Sophie safe. And I need you to know that whatever happens next, meeting you is the best thing that's come out of the worst years of my life." The next morning, the story broke. Victoria had sent her documentation to 3 major news outlets simultaneously, along with a sworn statement detailing Gregory's financial crimes. By noon, federal investigators were at Gregory's office. By evening, he'd been arrested. And by the time the sun set, Daniel's phone was ringing with calls from the client who'd canceled, apologizing for the miscommunication and begging to reinstate the contract. The pressure evaporated like it had never existed. Gregory's network, built on fear and favors, crumbled the moment he could no longer deliver on his threats. And Daniel sat on his couch that evening, Sophie curled up against his side, watching the news coverage of a powerful man brought down by his own arrogance. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "It's over. He's finished. But I realized something today." Daniel typed back, "What's that?" "I realized I've spent my whole life waiting for things to be over. Waiting for the danger to pass, the threat to end, the fear to fade. And I don't want to wait anymore. I want to start something. Start something with you." Daniel looked at his daughter, at the drawings on the walls and the chaos of their small, beautiful life. And he typed his response with hands that weren't shaking at all. "Then start. I'll be here." The wedding happened 14 months later, in a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens with Sophie as the flower girl and Daniel's mother crying through the entire thing. Victoria wore white and smiled like she'd forgotten how to frown. Daniel wore his best suit, finally picked up from the dry cleaner, and cried when he saw her walking toward him because he'd never imagined he'd get a second chance at this kind of happiness. Ryan came to the ceremony. He'd spent the months since that party night getting help for his gambling addiction, making amends where he could, and slowly rebuilding the friendship he'd nearly destroyed. He wasn't Daniel's best man. That honor went to someone new. But he was there, and his presence meant something about forgiveness and growth and the complicated nature of love. In his speech, Daniel said something that has stayed with me ever since I heard this story. He said, 3 years ago, I was a man who had given up on hoping for anything more than survival. I went to parties to prove I was alive, not because I expected to feel anything. And then I was dared to kiss the most serious woman in the room, and I was terrified, and I did it anyway. Not the kiss, but the approach. The honesty. The willingness to be seen as foolish. Because that's what love requires. It requires you to look stupid. It requires you to risk things that matter. It requires you to walk toward the thing that scares you, because your heart recognizes something your brain hasn't figured out yet. And then he looked at Victoria, and he said, "You were the scariest thing in that room. And I would walk toward you every single time." This story has stayed with me because it reminds me that life doesn't happen when we're safe. It happens when we're brave enough to be unsafe for something that matters. Daniel didn't know what he was getting into that night. He didn't know about Gregory's schemes or Victoria's secrets or the war he was about to step into. All he knew was that a woman across the room looked lonely in the same way he was lonely, and that felt like enough to start. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for being here, for caring about Daniel and Victoria and Sophie, for investing your time in a story about the complicated, messy, beautiful process of finding love when you've given up looking. I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments because this community has grown into something beautiful, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. And remember, the next time life dares you to do something terrifying, the next time it points you toward a person or a dream or a possibility that seems too intimidating to approach, maybe take the dare. Maybe walk toward the thing that scares you. You never know. It might be your whole life waiting to begin. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.